Okay, a couple of pressing questions. Laurence?
For your talk, I answer about emotion and dialogue system. So also, we begin work with people involved in military aspect for two kind of application. One is an interview, and the second one is how to train people to reinforce learning about what emotion they have, and also how they can deal with the emotion and to detect the emotion of the other parts. So all these topics are urgent, and we have to experiment things. And what we can do with the dialogue system is very limited at the time. And but at paralinguistic aspect and body language and all the cues that we can extract from face, voice, postural aspect, action, it's useful. I don't say it's a ground truth, I just say it's useful to detect and to learn with that kind of tool. So I am engaged in some experiments, some new things with Army and different aspects, so I can speak with you after. Thanks.
Let me be a bit provocative. I think, talking about virtue in terms of this specific AI application blurs the boundaries between humans and AI, which is not necessary at that point, I feel. Military virtues are, to be provocative again, are an invention for managing violence and managing people who apply violence to the point when all short incentives will fail. So keeping them under control then. And mankind did quite a well job with doing that. However, do you think this applies for AI as well? I don't agree with that. I think AI in the military domain is a tool, for the time being a very blunt tool, but a tool which applies brute force. And controlling that, I think we have technical mechanisms to keep that in check. And so virtues is perhaps not the promising path to that in my regard.
Let's take one more question. Angela?
Very much. I found these two presentations very, very interesting, but I also have a concern about it, and that is the absence of accountability. If you think about it, I'm a strong believer in basically a rules-based international order. And I find that when it comes to the use of AI in military conflicts, I'm not using the term war, because if you think about it, war has not been declared. You know, you mentioned that Middle East and Syria, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Somalia, you can add a lot of places where actually these weapons have been used. And you also sort of said, you know, the military kind of invests millions and billions, etc. Of course, they invest, but they don't actually make the weapons. I mean, that's the companies that make them, so there's an economic incentive behind it. The accountability I find particularly when it comes to robotic weapons, and I don't want to talk about the effort that takes place in Geneva. I have a little bit in my paper on that, and maybe it comes up, so let's leave that aside. But the casualty figures are not available. I must say that under the Obama administration, you actually had a drone policy. I found a lot to criticize about it, but I also thought that it was good that they had it. It was the only country that had it. Now, under Obama also, he instituted a policy about reporting on drone casualties. And that was, in the 8 years of Obama, it was about 1,800 and some. Under 2 years of Trump, it was over 2,000 already. And not only that, but just 2 months ago, he abolished the reporting, the transparency that comes from that. I find that very much of concern. And I'm also thinking about, when you think about a rules-based international order, you think about the Arms Trade Treaty. And I know that the US hasn't ratified it and so forth, and neither has China, Russia, India, the large-scale conventional arms exporters. But on the other hand, the reason for having that was to underbind or undercut the arms traders, you know, the rogue traders that basically moved back and forth between the conflicts, a lot of the arms, because there was a human rights clause in there, and there was also something about the government had to basically report if there was a possibility of a human rights abuse, then they would not be sold to that particular country. That is, and again it goes with the international rules-based order, that is out of the window now somehow. And I find that very much of concern, because where do we go with that? And, to talk only about the, about the virtue and the morality of using it, but you're really developing a two-class society, and the two classes about those who can afford the AI and its use in conflict situations, and those who cannot. And that is something that I really think we need to address, and that's one of the, maybe also the cross-cutting issues in terms of the use of your robots and AI, and how do we actually employ that in the day-to-day life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Great.
There's a tendency when we talk about AI in military settings, especially settings where there's lethal targeting going on, is a tendency to focus the discussion almost entirely on the lethal autonomous weapons. But actually what's happening is the battlefield itself, with human engagements on the battlefield, are being transformed as well. And so there's a whole set of tools that are developed in order to assist human soldiers in making their targeting decisions, also to increase their situational awareness, for example. So what we'd like to see maintained, and this is why we're appealing to the notion of virtue, is that the application of these new technologies does not decrease accountability, does not decrease responsibility, but actually their use increases responsibility, hence accountability. But it's I think it's important to realize that in war, in moral conduct more generally, there's always two issues. One is identifying what's right and wrong, and then a willingness to do what's right and avoid what's wrong. Right? And so if it would be too easy just to focus on the determination of right and wrong, but soldiers also have to be prepared and trained to be willing and even capable to do what's right. Right? So, and that's where the whole virtue angle comes in. And it's not just about thinking through, knowing in advance if X happens, I'll do Y, but it's also having an awareness of how I'm likely to respond emotionally in the battlefield settings. And there's been a big debate about whether emotion is a positive or negative, and I gave the optimist argument that we're better off doing without emotion, but that's a Stoic view, that emotion leads us astray. Then there's another view developed by thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, that emotion actually has a positive contribution when it's rightly ordered, and that's what virtue is about, in making correct decisions on the battlefield. Emotion can be an aid. It's not only an enemy, so to speak, of good moral judgment. Henrik, do you have any?
Add very briefly that I appreciate your question. And one can say provocatively, even cynically, that military virtues are ways of motivating people who otherwise wouldn't go into the battlefield to think that they're doing the right thing because they won't obey the rules if they don't. We don't need them with artificial intelligence in that way. But of course, the question we are trying to ask is, what does this demand of the human operators? And I said several times soldiers and officers, but there are many others. There are the decision makers actually making the decisions to employ them, which touches directly on Angela's a very important point. Are there specific ideals and virtues and rules that are even more important to abide by the minute you start introducing this sort of weaponry, but where it could be tempting to think in the exactly opposite direction? And transparency and accountability are among them. Maybe it's more needed than ever that we ask the questions, the basic questions about the body counts. Where was this weapon used? Was this any sort of declared armed conflict? So there I think that a mixture of a virtues and a rules approach is very useful. Thank you.
Henrik, would you also like to, or Greg, to remark on Laurent's question?
I just
training.
think it's an excellent point, and I think it's this question that segues well with what we've talked about earlier as well. How do you use artificial intelligence not as something that's isolated from questions of emotions and understanding each other, but also as a tool of understanding the other?
It's also a tool, as we have seen, to understand the cultural difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also the level of state-of-the-art of the others. So the research is fundamental in this purpose. And also, my other topic is ethics, so I push every time ethics in the first place.
Okay, thank you for the comments.
Just one additional point about Angela's question about the, we don't want to see further erosion of international humanitarian law, battlefield. I mean, one contribution that robotics could make to this would be robot observers on the battlefield that would keep close track of what human combatants are doing and report possible violations or ongoing or possible violations to Central Command. And this, of course, having that kind of tool could really promote accountability. I mean, there are big debates often. What happened on the battlefield? And wars, the word war comes from the Germanic root, thrown into disorder. So it's very, very hard to track this particular kind of disorder. So there could be tools that would promote a better tracking of battlefield conduct.
Well, thank you once again.